Is this going to be video though, ultimately?
I believe so.
You believe so? You're trying to show off your bird. That's all.
Oh yeah. Well, he's actually a dominant part of the channel. He's one of the co-hosts.
Oh, okay. Pardon me.
But we actually have just started recording. So hello and welcome to Write Better Stories, Ross Kenyon. For anyone who doesn't know Ross, he is a friend of mine and also the host of a very good podcast about climate change. But I'll let you introduce yourself actually, so you can take the floor, Ross.
Sure. Well, I am one of the co-founders of Nori, which is a carbon removal marketplace. Essentially, we try to make it easy for people to get paid for pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it. We mostly work with farmers, or well, I should say at this moment, we exclusively work with farmers. In the future, we're open to many different methodologies and means by which carbon can be stored in various places, so long as reasonably credible, ethical, etc. But yeah, we know each other from our Chicago days, creative filmmaking, goofing around over there. So still read a lot of books, still talk about books a lot on this podcast. I find a way to make reversing climate change have a lot of people whose literature and creative nonfiction show up on the show when I can.
So I was going to ask you about that. Like, how much of that do you feel like is just like central to the climate change issue, and how much of that is Ross kind of like inching his literary interests into the show?
It's it's definitely both. Um, One of the difficulties of making art, maybe you'll relate to this or maybe not, but one of the only ways, for instance, so I've written screenplays is mostly where I've spent my writing hours. And I find drama has always been harder for me than comedy. Because, if you're writing a comedy and it makes you laugh, you're like, all right, I at least know
Yes,
it makes,
there's a specific result that's supposed to happen.
yeah. And I can't guarantee that everyone else will connect to it in the same way, but I at least know, like, I can tell that it's good for a person kind of like me at the very least. Whereas drama was always harder for me to elicit that same kind of reaction. But it's the same for making podcasts. There are episodes that we've done before with very smart people who are very technical scientists, analysts of various types. And I think they're uh, interesting, but it isn't necessarily always the topics that I get the most out of personally. But people will write in and say that, oh, I love this episode with so and so. And I'm like, truthfully, I couldn't tell how good it was relative to the other episodes because it's just not that part of my brain. But maybe one of my colleagues said, this person, you should talk to them. Whereas if I do one about my active interests, it's a lot easier to tell. But it's also a running joke about having to make it at least partially about climate change so I don't get ousted by my colleagues. Yeah, you're right.
I had a professor in college once that he would play us guitar solos, and it was a philosophy class, but usually there was some tenuous connection to philosophy where it would be like a band and some of their other songs had lyrics about like Eastern religions. And then I remember one day he played us this like 20-minute guitar solo and he was like, well, I guess there's no literal connection to philosophy, but I get that though. And I thought that was interesting too, what you said about like not necessarily always knowing what people are going to react to, because a lot of times those things I've just seen in different creative mediums, the thing that you are just so stoked about is going to completely like reinvent the medium. People are just kind of like meh, and then it's the ones that sometimes you're just kind of like going through the motions with that people end up really liking. So it's kind of frustrating, you know. But that's cool that it can be that easy too.
It can be, but there's no guarantee that it transcends your own interior experience and anyone connects with it in any meaningful capacity.
That
Uh,
is true. That is true. So is that the kind of connection to like literature and climate change issues, that it's supposed to be about that like connection for the audience, or like how would you describe the way that like literature and creative nonfiction has a crossover with your climate change podcast and just in general?
some of them are directly applicable, and there are genres and subgenres of literature that are just about climate change, like climate fiction, cli-fi they call it.
Wi-Fi, okay,
Um,
I haven't heard that one.
yeah, yeah, that's very much in vogue right now. Perhaps the best example of it that I could think of offhand is Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, which he's a very prominent science fiction author and has been for decades. And I don't know when you're planning on airing this, but we got to sit down with him for a couple hours and talk. One of my colleagues who's a science fiction obsessed person. And so that's sort of like near future exploration of what comes out of climate change and how people respond to it, how it's dealt with, you know, for, win, lose, or draw. Here are sort of predictions, some of which is perhaps wishful thinking of directions that we could go from here. But there are also books like Jenny Offel's Weather. Do you know that book?
I'm not familiar.
That definitely made the more like literary. So it was climate fiction, but it wasn't like Ministry for the Future, which was very directly about technology, social institutions, how we deal with climate change. Whereas climate change was just in the background as something that happened, and here are characters who are working through it. I felt more character driven perhaps than theme. And we always talk about this, right? It's like the only partition that I have to make sense of writing.
That is true. Yeah, because that was going to be one of my questions about cli-fi, and I am completely a outsider to all of that, so I wouldn't really know. But if you were to sort of play like cli-fi literary academic critic for a second, would you say that like a lot of those like themes end up being more central to the work, or do you think more often than not it's like it's kind of the like dressing for it?
I think to write a book now, it's a conscious decision, but I don't think Cormac McCarthy in writing The Road, that's, I think technically qualifies as being climate fiction. There's some sort of nuclear winter event that has happened.
Right, yeah.
But the point of that book is about hope, right? And parenthood. And it's the background. It's not about climate change. Whereas the other two books I've mentioned, they're about climate change, whether it's foregrounded or not. It's there. It's what the book is about. It wouldn't be the same book if it wasn't in a climate change near future.
Okay, that makes sense. So then, obviously, what like immediately comes to mind for me would just be a lot of these like kind of warning scenarios, or of these like worst case scenarios. Then could you describe some of the more hopeful ones? Like, what does that look like? Because I'm definitely somebody who comes from, as you know, like a more strong interest in these stories that kind of like crack you on the head at the end and don't make you feel very good. And so, like, what does this like positive bent look like? What's a happy ending, Ross? I've never heard of one of those.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think The Ministry for the Future does have a happy ending. It's basically, I mean, the book is premised upon meaningful change on climate change not happening for another couple of years, and then what happens to change the world where we're able to address it in meaningful ways and move forward as a species, and not have this be some catastrophic blow permanently. Humans are able to reform the social structures that got us here. Kim Stanley Robinson is a leftist of some variety, and that's how he describes himself. I'm not sure exactly which camp he ultimately ends up in, but he's broadly of the left. And so the book is almost in some ways an imagining forward of what a Green New Deal would look like.
Okay.
So I think the book is optimistic. It's saying like, this is the chance for humans to figure this out. Capitalism, before that feudalism, empire. Here's how we move from these sort of zero sum environments into something more cooperative. So that book is hopeful. There's also one, actually, I even have a visual aid because it's sitting right in front of me.
Oh, perfect. We love that.
I think I was just telling you about this.
Oh yeah, you're gonna have him on, right? Or did you?
Working on it.
You're working. Okay,
the
sorry.
Vince-
I didn't mean to.
yeah. You can edit that maybe. But yeah. I mean, Paul Kingsnorth is maybe an example of someone who's a lot more grim. He wrote a great collection of yeah, like creative nonfiction essays called Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist, where he was formerly a sort of left-wing climate environmental activist, and then kind of just gave up hope. Just like, it's too late. Like, we're living in sort of a collapse that hasn't realized it's a collapse yet. And so he started a literary project called the Dark Mountain Project, which is a collection of essays, creative works, people just dealing with a world that doesn't realize that it's kind of over yet. A lot of it's very thoughtful, dark, grim. He's written novels too, but uh, it's broadly primitivist in its orientations. Technology hasn't served us well. We don't believe in limits anymore, and so the lack of limits means we just do whatever we want, which usually is not really good for the environment or ourselves even.
Mhm.
So maybe that's an example of climate fiction that is,
A little more pessimistic.
yeah. Or you can read people like, do you know Roy Scranton? You ever hear of him?
No.
He was a veteran. He was served in Iraq, I believe, and he wrote a book called shit, what is it? He has one that's called. It's such like a shit, man. I'm just gonna look it up because it's gonna make the point for me.
Mhm.
And it's not fiction, but one is called "We're Doomed Now What." Oh, the other one that I was thinking of is called "Learning How to Die in the Anthropocene." So
Oh, wow. Okay.
it was about, like, he was saying that to become a good soldier, he learned when he was in Iraq, you have to accept the fact that you're already dead, and you can't be a good soldier until you have admitted to yourself that you're dead, because you're scared of dying. But once you make peace with the fact that you're dead, you can act. So he says this is
Already
the
dead.
you're already dead. And so
Okay.
this is how we should understand ourselves as humans in a time of climate change, climate crisis, etc.
So this is a bit of a pivot, but that just made me think is that like around the time that I was writing my first book, I was really into like fiction that depicted dead people. And so I had been reading like Pedro Paramo, which I'm going through again right now, which is like one of the earlier magical realism like kind of pillars of the genre. It might have been one of the first ones to do that. And then I was reading Ubik by Philip K. Dick, which is all about like the half life and things like that. And so there's also a Vanity article, I think, too, that looks at literary analysis through the lens of imagining everything taking place in the afterlife, even if that's not explicitly stated in the story that you're reading. And I've just always thought that was interesting because it does bring this kind of like heightened symbolic like importance to everything. And I'd be interested to hear more about like what does this guy say about like because this is more of like a courage thing, right? If this guy is saying you need to imagine that you're already dead so you don't fear death, like is there am I reading too much into this? Because that just like immediately sent my brain toward all of this. Like, what does that do to a story when all of the characters are dead?
No, there's a lot to say about this, and there's a bunch of active debates, fights about topics that are this or adjacent to this. For instance, there's a trope of climate doom is equivalent to climate denial, or it's the new climate
Oh,
denial.
okay.
So a tendency to think that like Jonathan Franzen wrote a big essay at New Yorker talking about climate doom, and many of the climate scientists and people that I keep track of all hated it because they're like, oh, an author discovered climate change and wrote a discouraging article about it, and it's going to
Oh,
turn a bunch of people into doomers rather than being like, we can still do this, we can still Green New Deal or tech or whatever is your hopeful solution. Instead, it turned people into this sort of nihilistic gloom, we're toast kind of attitude. But I often find it's useful to frame big questions about humanity. Like reading Paul Kingsnorth always does that for me. It's like what, or Wendell Berry is a good example too. I know you want to talk about Wendell Berry, but
That's right. His name is like, I take my recommendations based on like multiple times of hearing the name, and I've heard that name just like too many times, specifically from you, so that like he's officially on my list now. So
yeah, he's pretty interesting. That's such a banal way of saying it, but I'll say one more thing about like those debates too, which
sure.
is that I understand why people write these doom kind of essays sometimes, because most of the climate stuff you hear about has a sort of techno utopian sort of optimistic, it's like they're all like a lot of venture backed companies, like Nori perhaps, but I try to think we try to tonally balance it and be like cautiously optimistic but also aware of the discourse that surrounds what we're trying to do, and if anything is important enough, people are going to have meaningful and interesting disagreements about it. um but Yeah, I understand why people will get frustrated with seeing like, oh, Bill Gates is doing this, or oh, some fancy Silicon Valley company promises to fix all of our ecosystem collapse. And you're just like, yeah, right. Yeah, right. You tech bros in finance, you caused this. You're not going to do anything. Like, stop lying. You just want to become a billionaire. So I don't know. There's a whole lot of that going around. That wasn't necessarily the most coherent, but maybe that's okay.
Oh no, no. Well, that just makes me think too, is that like it's so tough with like the discourse that kind of surrounds any societal issue, because yeah, it's, you have to kind of marry pessimism and optimism to the facts, and then sometimes like the immediate controversial figure that comes to mind is like Sam Harris, who is somebody that it's like, in order to be optimistic about it, we have to have an honest conversation and like confront the doom and that kind of thing. But when something is as staggering as something like climate change, like to fully confront that is something that I could see would just sort of, turn people cynical, especially when it is something that like, as an individual, it feels like an enlightened take to know that it's not up to us. It's about these systems and it's about these kind of like broad scale things. Like I remember hearing Slavoj Žižek say something like that, that like they commodify your activism by having you buy your recycled cup.
Yeah,
And
that's the great Zizek bit. I think
yeah,
about
well,
that one
and
a
I,
lot.
I like that, and just because it feels really clever, because you get to kind of like unmask it for everybody else, that you can be like, oh, you think like you're doing something, but like, you need to wake up, people. And that's fun, but then at the same time, it's like, to fully confront the issue is to resign yourself to knowing that like you as an individual doesn't have a ton of power over it, right? Am I
Yeah.
just talking people into being nihilistic?
No, I think you're right. I've thought about this question a lot just personally, and I imagine most people have, because it's one of the biggest ones you can try to answer in your life. There's a quote I come back to a lot, and I always forget if it's Dostoevsky or Kierkegaard, but the quote is, one doesn't pray to change the mind of God, one prays to change the person praying. So it isn't, it's more about your relationship to God, or to whatever, than it is necessarily to God sitting up there being like, oh, that prayer, like, it was intercessionary enough. And he did bring in Saint Joseph was in the mix now, so I think I will change the outcome of this. And so, like, I guess Kierkegaard or Dostoevsky is arguing maybe that's the incorrect way to view prayer. um, this could all be heretical. I have no idea, Danny. I don't know how any of that works.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, yeah. What did you just ask me? Oh, what to do? Yeah, I used to take this as a very cynical game theoretic approach in a prisoner's dilemma, being like, okay, if I do the right thing, pretty much most other people are not going to care or even notice. So I'm going to take the bus, which is objectively less comfortable and good than being in my own private car. And climate change still happens. So you lost twice, right? You had to take the bus and climate change still happened. Um, but also, if the only thing you control are your own actions, which sort of underlies that prisoner's dilemma, logic, should that matter more or less to you what you do? And I used to think it matters less. Like if everyone's going to be greedy, you should be greedy too. But if you want to control your own actions, then I think you should be more virtuous than that. Not that I always perfectly live this or do this, but I'm at least no longer rhetorically on the side of like, yeah, microeconomics, just you're a self-interested maximizer, just go for it. And I'm like,
Yeah.
you should maybe cooperate.
Well,
Maybe go for it.
because yeah, I think it like in order for it to be a moral action, it doesn't necessarily have to change, like the meat industry. It like you could kind of validate your moral action through just like knowing that it's a good in itself and like look for consequential change elsewhere. But I guess that's just where I get a little like in my head about it because I really like kind of empirical things and like language philosophy and things that have like a more direct like this points to that and that does that. And so like anytime that people start talking about like moral philosophy, it always kind of feels like just a gut feeling, which I guess at my most cynical to me is like, well, if that, rustles your cockles, then it's good. But yeah, I guess maybe in a way that like it's not a good case for morality, but it's just kind of like in a way that I believe beyond needs like explanation. Those seem like good things to do as a consumer, even if they're not going to like topple everything that got us here.
I do agree with that Zizek point though, of there's something that's pernicious about selling you something that probably has an impact negatively much greater than the positive impact of the recycled cup. But instead of just being neutral about it or not saying anything about it, it's sort of commenting where it's almost like the more cups of coffee I buy, the better I make the world. It's this virtual
Yeah,
feedback loop. It's like the absolution tied in with the sin at the same time. He's like, it's empirically a lie, but two, it's just this pernicious way of doing business that just obscures the truth in some really harmful way. I always thought that was a very, I mean, Zizek is always full of those things. That's what he does, right?
yeah.
Just
He
whatever you think, the opposite of it.
exactly. Yeah, like I feel like you can do an impression of his thought pattern as if it's like you think that you want this, but it's actually just the opposite. And you're like, oh, okay, yeah, you're right, Zizek. Now, like anything that I think is true, now I think the opposite is now true. But now my life is way better.
Yeah, he's that's what he does. He's got one trick. It's a very good trick, and it's
Yeah,
dressed up in Lacan and Hegel,
sure.
so maybe
Yeah.
it works.
I was thinking about that though. When have you seen that? Like, I think this is a meme now too of that like terrible Grubhub commercial where it's like really, really high quality animation and it's all of these like kind of suburban people doing these like twerky dances and stuff.
No.
Okay,
What?
so like I guess watch it if you want to. It's not so bad that you're going to want to die, but it's like a pretty tasteless commercial. And there's been like videos and stuff of people editing out the music, and it's just these like terrible animated figures like dancing and stuff. But like what's interesting about it is like the beat that they have going for it has those kind of like electronic music hip hop flutes with it, and it's like a really kind of hip hop inspired beat, and the dance is just straight up hip hop. But then this is for like Grubhub, this huge corporate thing, and it makes me think that like since people have caught on that this is a totally tasteless commercial, and then broader, when you see that like corporations are trying to appeal to some sort of like countercultural movement and then they subsume the movement into them, that does sort of inspire people to push further because it's not cool anymore. And I'm not saying that this like Grubhub commercial necessarily has had that impact yet, like not like hip hop is going anywhere, but like just the idea though that maybe one of the things that kind of drives progress is like these corporate entities taking over the like older modes of resistance and then people having to like reinvent new ones in order to um like just aesthetically not be as gross, but then too maybe just like invent new ones as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. trying to think back in the day. Back in the day for us, Danny, I'm thinking probably the first environmental thing you might remember is probably like Al Gore,
That's exactly
Inconvenient
right.
Truth.
It was very
Yeah.
controversial at my conservative high school. Some parents were not pleased that we showed an Al Gore documentary.
How dare you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so if you watch the rhetorical changes that happen over time in environmental spaces, at least from there, I imagine that used to be like green, sustainable. That was a thing. Now, if a brand describes themselves as sustainable, you're like, yeah, we've done that.
Yeah.
That term is not in vogue. It's not enough. And
Right.
like, so now terms have been regenerative, which is going beyond sustainable, being like on net, producing more environmental or ecological benefit than you're taking out, and trying to create companies like this. So I wonder how many of them are genuine. Many of them are genuine, and I imagine some of them are like truly regenerative. I imagine some of them are like that Zizek example,
Yeah.
and it's just like you're like, oh, you mean the more of this I consume, the better off the planet it is? There's no reason to like stop consuming anything. And you're like, yeah, that's, you probably shouldn't teach people that lesson.
Right.
At least at least in general. There are probably cases where that is true. Like I bet there are some types of agricultural products that are like integrated enough and hip to the various ecologies they're participating in enough where you're like, oh, this is probably on net like better to participate in than not. It's probably not true for wherever you get your concrete or something. Oh, good stuff happening with concrete too. I don't know.
Regenerative concrete.
There is cool stuff happening that is being worked on for that.
Really?
Um, yeah.
Like what?
Um, well, concrete by emissions, if you take it as an industrial sector, has a bigger emissions impact than tons of countries. It's huge. Concrete's gigantic, but there are various ways of producing it where um, instead of having to feed CO2 into the production process, it is sort of able to absorb it ambiently, or
Oh,
you're able to take captured CO2 that's taken from a factory that would otherwise emit it and then like pump that into the system. So it's at least closer to neutral. Um, so, but yeah, is it truly negative? Is it better to like right now to use more concrete rather than less from an emission standpoint? Like I don't think we're there,
okay.
but it also how you count these things matters a lot too.
Mhm.
So, and sometimes people count them and it looks really great. Sometimes you can count it and it's so big that you can't differentiate what this one action is from anything else because it's all connected. Blah, blah, blah. There's a lot.
Hmm. That's interesting. So are you saying then that it's like is this like kind of a growing shift that's happening in that industry, or is this just like we've got some guys that are working on some new so people are starting to do this?
Oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of conferences and companies are trying to make progress in that way. There's a lot of work on what's called the circular economy. So maybe the best example is Patagonia's Wornwear project. So if you have a Patagonia item of clothing and it starts deteriorating, you can send it into them and they will fix it for you for free. I
Wow.
think you just pay for the shipping label and they'll send it right back. Um, I've done that before. It's pretty cool. But there's also trying to make products that are carbon negative, um, or we have people that are participating in various offset projects. But I don't know. There's a lot of quality differences between what's on offer there, and it's complicated. Even as someone who works in it, it isn't always super clear. The details of these things matter a lot, and there's a lot out there.
Yeah, I guess like how interested in that are you as a podcast host and like founder of that of Nori, co-founder, to give credit to your compatriots, is like how interested in the idea of like exposing what is just brand and what is like actually an integrated, sustainable, or regenerative approach within a business?
Yeah, it's a good question. Just at least internally, we try to be really transparent, and the podcast is a big part of that. Pardon me. We've done episodes that have been Nori centric. So a lot of people on from Nori, and we'll talk about things we've learned, things we did wrong. Here's what we're going to do differently. And I don't know that a lot of companies are going out of their way to publicly issue wrong turns that they've made. And so we at least value that as a company.
Oh,
But
I didn't mean necessarily for Nori. I just meant like in general. But
oh
I
yeah,
appreciate the transparency. That's great.
yeah, I understand. I was gonna maybe work my way into zooming out, but no, I mean we watch it, and there are sometimes you'll see certain types of environmental commitments and the ways that they are met, and either we or someone else that we know will look into it, or there's actually quite a growing muckraking industry of journalists who look into environmental commitments by big companies, be like, yeah, this doesn't make sense and this doesn't work and this is just a giant greenwash, and don't believe it. So um, I don't spend a ton of time doing that myself personally. I think I'd rather be
Out
reading
the field,
books.
trying to
Yeah.
take them down.
Yeah. No, I try to be generous, ecumenical, assuming best intentions. Um, but there are certainly limitations to that too.
I gotcha. Yeah, I used to work at a company, and I won't throw them under the bus, but they described themselves as like eco fill in the blank of their industry, and then they were like publicly called out for using plastic water bottles for like everything. And and it kind of back to the Zizek thing. It's not like that is they alone are sustaining that entire industry, but that was just like a brief controversy. But I did want you to talk a little bit about some of the more like conservative movements within climate change and climate change activism, because that's something that like your average person, I think, usually associates like more liberal and progressive minded people. But could you give us some kind of like overview or introduction toward like what does a conservative climate change activist look like, and what's the thrust of their message?
Yeah, they're out there, and they've been on our podcast various times, and um, I guess what first comes to mind is someone like Benji Backer from American Conservation Coalition.
Wait, Backer?
Yeah,
Like Backer?
yeah,
This could be
like
a
like Baker in German. Is that where you're going?
yeah. Well, that's my last name. If
You're a
that was not
baker.
clear,
You guys are related, probably. Yeah.
might be. Sorry to interrupt, but that yeah it could be some family relation.
The only two Baker families in all of Northern Europe a couple hundred years
I
ago.
actually think it's a Dutch name, but
Oh
it was
yeah.
changed like in immigration. Is that it's like Bacher is the German way.
Huh.
I don't know if there was any like anti-German sentiment during immigration. Anyway, though, but you can continue.
Yeah. There's a bunch of different approaches though. I think for the most part, people have moved past the like denial phase with climate change, and most of the people who used to occupy those positions in some regard are more what's called lukewarmists, which means it's going to get somewhat warmer, but it's not going to be that much, and the damages are not going to be catastrophic, or we'll be able to adapt to them pretty easily or cheaply or both, and stuff like that. So, and there's some of that going on, but then there are also conservatives who, like Benji Backer and that crew, is more um, like how do you leverage the power of markets and private property rights to get us a lot of the way there. What can be done that doesn't require something like spending trillions of dollars and Green New Deal and jobs guarantees and stuff that conservatives, recognize as being, a somewhat large departure from how things are often done. Which is one of the selling points to progressives who care about climate change. Like, this is a chance to do a lot of the changes we would have otherwise wanted to make but couldn't. So if we can tie this all up together, we can knock a bunch of these things down at the same time. Whereas conservatives tend to be more focused. So maybe they want like a carbon fee and dividend. So maybe you get taxed for how much carbon you emit, but that comes back to you like a universal basic income or a tax credit. It doesn't, the money collected doesn't go to fund an even more expansive welfare state. Maybe that's a decent introduction.
Okay, that's interesting. So then, just to clarify, would you say that like their objections to a lot of the sort of like progressive leaning climate change fight has more to do with just like the kind of traditional conservative ideology of like not liking big government and any idea of like a central body that's targeted, or is this as specific as them like going through a progressive agenda on climate change and like disliking the actual points that's going through it?
I think that's part of it. And the term I've heard used for this is called solution aversion, which is that if you don't like the solution proposed to some problem, you will, you know, dig the trenches back as far as you can. So you like deny that it's even a problem, and then you can retreat to the second line and say it's a problem, but your solutions are not going to work, and you just like it keeps going in that way. So I think given that most of the solutions to climate change for a long time were seen as intrusive policy changes, that's like the best case interpretation for why conservatives were slow to move on climate, as far as I know. There's also people like Naomi Oreskes, who wrote a book with Eric Conway, I think is his name, called Merchants of Doubt, which links the sort of tobacco lung cancer denial, or the scientists who cast doubt upon whether tobacco was actually bad for you, and how a lot of those people ended up making the move to climate denial, and these sort of scientists for hire that will say, "Oh, it's not that big of a deal." So that's the uncharitable version.
Okay.
Um, I'm sure there are, I'm sure there are people of good faith and of bad faith who did both. But yeah, that happens.
Well, as always, I'm way less interested in the real world than just the philosophy behind it. So I we can overstep sorting who's into good faith and bad faith within that. But I guess to shift things a little bit more toward literature, I'm interested to see how some of like the traditional narrative elements end up getting these themes across within these climate change books, because I think some people, and granted people who don't have familiarity with the sort of thing that they're resistant to, um the notion is that like anything with that strong of like a political message might sort of just use the characters as talking pieces in order to get these political ideas out, or to sort of, have these thin characters just so you can have like the big world and the post-apocalyptic society and investing more in that from a writing standpoint. So um yeah, how would you say you've seen, just from like maybe from a strictly creative perspective, some of these ideas get implemented, from your perspective as a writer and creative?
There's a number of directions to go. I think in some ways the nonfiction's been better at this, because you are right. Most of the historical fiction, science fiction, speculative fiction that I've read has felt very driven by theme or message, in a way where like, I know what the author was trying to say, and they tailored a character around their ability to say this in a convincing way. It doesn't feel like just like a stroke of inspiration that this character exists. I know this person. I feel this person.
Mhm.
It's much more cerebral than that. And I think all of those genres are like that. For instance, I've read a bunch of James Michener books. Do you know him?
No, not familiar.
he he sometimes gets trashed as an airport book guy, but he wrote Tales from the South Pacific, which became South Pacific, the musical. And
Oh, okay.
yeah, he would write books about a place. Like he's written books about one about Hawaii that starts with the geological origins of the islands.
My
You know,
grandpa loved that book.
it's a cool book. And I can, but like, I think I've read a bunch of his books, especially if I was ever traveling somewhere. If you look up if there's a James Michener about it, it gives you a nice introduction. It's weird to read though, because some of it is dated in a funny way where it was like racially progressive for the time it was written, but even still, it looks like really out of date now. So
Yeah,
you're just like, ooh, you're trying, but this didn't age very well. Sorry to tell you.
their heart
Um,
was in the right place.
Yeah, for his time, I think he was trying at least. Uh, Crap, I just derailed myself here. But anyway, oh yeah, Mishner. Yeah, I never, I very rarely remember characters from his books. I remember the feeling of being there. I remember the feeling of existing in this environment and the time, but it's not like I'm jonesing to go back to any of the characters and compare that to other books. Like, I mean, Tolstoy's writing historical fiction. War and Peace is about Napoleon's invasion of Russia. um, I remember those characters super well. It's successful character driven historical fiction, which is pretty rare. um, but I don't know that climate fiction or those genres have really nailed it. And the nonfiction, I think, is Elizabeth Colbert, I think, is my favorite writer, especially of nonfiction in the climate world. She's a New Yorker writer, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and she has a new book coming out called Under a White Sky. And she's one of those writers, Danny, that you would love/hate because she makes it look so easy. Like it's such a elegant way of composition that I'm always struck reading it. I'm like, wow, like I could write a book. You're like, no, she hides the craft. That's how good. There's no artifice. She just it's just perfectly written. So and I feel like some of the characters from that and those images are really strong. But I think you are right. I think there's a tendency to world build and to try to say something about climate, and it potentially harms some of the literary value of some of the things that I've read.
Well, I think I'm kind of open minded on that kind of stuff too, because I think kind of like with film. Did you see that movie Mandy with Nicolas Cage?
No, I'm not familiar.
So I mean, this is like not a deep movie by any means, but it's like it's really fun and it's very well shot, and there's a lot of just like interesting visual play in it. And I think that like to kind of evaluate it for some sort of like literary arc would be to kind of miss the point of what Mandy is trying to do. And so sometimes like I don't really like it sometimes when people are like character above all else, you must like dive into the depths. And it's like I don't know, sometimes it's like it's kind of fun to read an essay that somebody just put in a fictional form. And like I think there's a market for that, and there's like an interest to get across those ideas because it can make them a little bit more like approachable than just reading something that's like straight up informative or something like that. But maybe I just say that because I worry that my own writing is very like theme heavy and like character. Like well, we'll get to the characters. They'll come through at some point.
And we've talked about this so many times, and I'm the same way. I'm like, what am I satirizing? What am I really trying to do here? Does this person represent the sort of middle class ideal of domesticity in the exact right way that I need to design ex ante, or no? It's like there certainly is a, I don't know. It feels artificial sometimes, or they feel wooden.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Um, but I don't know. A lot of those, you're totally right, though. It's fine to put this stuff into literary form or creative or fictional form and express it in that way. But I think the books that you read that really stick with you are typically not those. At least for me, like I remember, for instance, I don't remember what happens in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, but I remember the characters. I remember their relationship. I remember it's something about Prague and communism, and that's kind of all I remember. But I remember being there in the, like the sense of the feeling of these characters. Um, so I don't know what's more important. I don't know. I guess you can also learn a lot from just reading historical fiction, and who cares about the characters? You're not there for the characters. You're there for the history.
Yeah, and just to like go and live in that time for
Yeah.
a moment. So I felt that when I was reading Warlock by Oakley Hall, because like
Mm.
90% of the characters are old, dusty, dirty cowboys. And so
Oh.
like the main four, I'm like, okay, I know those guys. And then there's like all these extra side characters that he'll just kind of not mention for 50 pages and then bring back. And after a while in my mind, it's like the same extra dusty, dirty cowboy that came along. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's like still a fantastic book, and like I guess that is kind of an idea-driven book too. But that makes me think that like for character building, one of the difficult parts of that is that like you kind of do need to start with a concept. I think, but and maybe that's just because I am interested in more idea-driven things. But I wonder, like, what would the opposite approach be? Like, you just do you base it on someone you know, or you base like, because if you want them to be complex, it's almost like, how do you sketch them? Like, how do you outline it? Because you'd have to like make some sort of concrete decisions about like, they're all at the end of the day they're about regret, or like at the end of the day they're about the forgotten memories of yesteryear's past, and then you like put additional details on them, and then hopefully they would become complex eventually. But like sometimes I think when writers and directors talk about this like total absence of theme, that's a little bit of like kind of wanting to obscure their brushstrokes, because
It's a
like,
show about nothing, Danny.
right, because I don't know, like some of these people that say that, like, because like David Lynch, I think does it right, because David Lynch's movies are obviously about things, but when he's asked about what they mean, he just says, "I'm not going to tell you," and that's like, I think that's honest, because that's like, both I'm not going to explain the thing that I did, but also it's like, come on, David Lynch's movies are about things. Whereas like Paul Thomas Anderson, love the man, but he's just like, yeah, the no theme, no symbol. It's like, yeah, yes, there is. Yes, there so is. There are themes, and the Coen brothers are the same way, that they're just like, nope, just about a thing. And I'm just like, I just don't buy that. Like, they'd have to be so oblivious to this like dream catcher of symbolism that they've carefully woven together by total accident, right?
Yeah. Well, I've told you this before too. We have a mutual friend that I would sometimes team up with on projects because he would have just a lightning bolt of inspiration, and he would have an idea for a character, a scene, a moment. He just knew there was something in there intuitionally. He would experience it by proxy, almost like a remote viewing psychic thing. Yeah. Like it really felt, or it reminds me of the Midnight in Paris with Salvador Dali being like, imagine a rhinoceros. And he's just like pulls like a rhinoceros out of nowhere. He's like, that's what I'm going to paint. Um, that's what it was like working with this guy, which was fun for me to experience, because it isn't, because I would be like, okay, but be like, what's so what moves this person? Sort of like where, like who are they? And like some of my writing, especially for I mostly wrote in comedy, and so I was always trying to make it about something. And I always had a sort of a satirist pen. That was sort of what I was going for always.
Okay.
So I was always looking for, I'm like, what's like the best way to make fun of this idea that I find really silly. But I don't know. I also got that note a lot, being like, yeah, this is not really like a real person. This is clearly just a person you constructed to express something. So the alternative is you just are a wild, creative, intuitional person, and maybe you don't have any structure. Maybe it doesn't mean anything, but it's I don't know, white light. I don't know what it is, man.
Yeah. Well, I think that is just the importance of collaboration, because like ideally I think you have both, because you don't want it to be so predictable and so structured that it's it's just like obvious what's going to happen, and that sort of thing. But
Yeah.
hmm, yeah, that, I mean, that, I obviously there's not like a concrete answer to that, but like, I don't know. I always just like to try to somehow put it into words in order to say some sort of like rule about it.
No, and there was oftentimes good parts of working together too. They would give me some real flesh and blood humans, and I would give them some structure, so it was a story that our brains expect, and it wasn't just like, is that the end? Like, yeah, you captured lightning in a bottle for 3 minutes. I'm not sure what it is. Um, I don't know. I like that sort of relationship between the more chaotic and orderly.
That is true. Yeah, because it is like, I feel myself losing more and more interest in that kind of stuff
Yeah,
recently.
right. Yeah, right.
Really?
you you're just, I guess you read like a couple hard boiled detective novels, and now you think you care about plot.
That's
What?
Ross. I'm a changed man.
You're changed right now.
Postmodernism. Like, I was never even that into this stuff. I'm just like, I'm saying, give me something that's traditional, straightforward. What I mean more specifically though is kind of, I think, like short form content that the main purpose of it is to have that kind of like flash of something bizarre and chaotic. Because I was actually thinking more like Tim and Eric, not necessarily because I still love postmodernism, and every time I say I'm gonna go read something else, I go read something else, and I'm like, that like wasn't really like that, so I'm gonna like go back to that. Um,
Mhm.
but I think too, kind of in a disappointing way, a lot of postmodern stuff actually does have that through line, but it's so complicated with all of the extra ideas that they throw in there that you'd have to read it a couple times to realize that it actually is like a traditional story, which is, yeah, kind of, I think, disappointing because I probably told you that with like Ant Kind, which was one of my favorite books I read last year, because just like some of the scenes that he came up with are just truly bizarre. Of like, he kind of like naturally leads you to this point where the main character has left the traditional world to go into the land of like marginalized identities that appear off screen of the narrative that you're watching, and he comes back in and finds another version of himself and has to like dress up as a clown in order to like debate him about this art film that he watches. And it's like, it's fucking hilarious too, for as like complicated as it is to describe. It's like it plays really funny, but then it just like flies off the rails. And there's enough going on that you kind of think like, oh, I'll bet on like a second or third reading this would really cohere into something that was really held together. And like I did not get that part of it. For as much as I enjoyed it, I was just kind of like, okay, like there's a tonal shift at the end and the character's a little different now. So I assume something in the past 70 pages like transformed him and gave him like a neat conclusion. But um yeah.
Sounds
So
kind
I
of
think
like Synecdoche, New York, a continuation of that. Yeah, that film kills me too.
that one I think is a little more contained. I feel,
Oh wow,
yeah. So but I mean that says more about Antkind, I think. But
yeah, maybe so.
you know what? I think that we are approaching about an hour, so I think we can wrap up. So, how about you remind us about your podcast one more time, and then give us a little something to be hopeful about for climate change, Ross.
Yeah, the podcast is called Reversing Climate Change. I don't think I said that yet, but you can tune in. A lot of cool authors on, and also entrepreneurs working in carbon removal, policy, art. Did an episode about sailing not too long ago. That was pretty fun. Um, yeah, something to be hopeful for. I don't know. I think uh, what is it? Am I hopeful? I don't. um,
No pressure.
I think the amount of attention stuff about climate change is getting, and not just from the people you would expect. Like I'm seeing people beyond just progressives caring about climate change. I think is important, and I think it's useful for people to be finding ways to interact with each other that does not involve yelling or nearly so much yelling. So I'm wondering if maybe some of that is hopeful, helpful. We'll see. Um, we didn't even get to Wendell Berry though. Did you even crack that guy yet or no?
No,
Yeah,
he's literally in my cart, but I have not read him yet.
yeah.
But I'm hopeful to read him. So
You're so obsessed with these authors who are like, I wrote a book, and guess what? The book talks about how it's a book inside of the book. Oh, isn't that so clever?
no, I just like it when it's like a simple story, just a character going on a journey. Like they go on a big race, and at the end they win the race after going through a series of 3 trials and being advised by a wise man. Always a wise man.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, I wonder about that too. Dude, can I spiel for just one more second?
Please, yeah,
The I'm like everyone else, I'm really sick of the anti-hero being at the heart of every serial drama that exists right now.
that's true.
Uh, it started with at least Tony Soprano. And Walter White confirmed it. And now it's like, how many Ozarks and whatever else do you need in the world? Is he a good guy or is he the bad guy? I don't know. It changes every episode. And I'm really happy to see, because I was worried that the only alternative would be something like John Wayne movies, Cowboys and Indians, and now I hear that there's Ted Lasso, which is maybe doing this.
What is
Do you know
that?
this? Jason Sudeikis has a show about being, I think, a rugby coach, or maybe it's a soccer coach.
Oh,
But apparently, that's something that's just like good. No moral ambiguity. It was sad that all of our shows were about moral ambiguity. Didn't bode well for our civilization. So
yeah.
maybe we're catching glimpses of something coming through. I don't know.
All right. Well, yeah, we'll have to see if that introduces a new trend that could
And
undo a lot of storytelling. But maybe
I
that's
had
what
a little. That's my. I think that's what I would change my answer to, basically, of my hope.
you're you're hopeful that we're not going to be doing as many anti-heroes.
Uh huh.
Um, yeah. See, I don't know, because I think like that's one of those things that it like I'm not sure how relative it is. To me, it does seem sort of like, or like maybe the most charitable interpretation of the anti-hero is that it's like this is an advancement past these kind of like morally static figures and characters that dive more into like the complexity of what it feels like it means to be a human, where we can't believe that people are just like good or just bad. And how did like because to move past that, wouldn't that just be to go back to the same static like moral thing, or can you still get that complexity in there?
I don't know. The way that it always has been for comedy, right? Is you either have to have like the world is crazy and there's a straight man, or the character is crazy and the world is sane. So it's like Jason Bateman in Arrested Development, right? Like
That's
straight
his whole
man,
career.
family's crazy. What's that?
That's his whole career, because even on Ozark, so many of his reactions are just like,
Oh, really? Okay, yeah.
I mean,
I don't know.
he is the anti-hero too, because he's like Mr. I'm gonna pull a bunch of lies out of my ass to schmooze you. But I don't know. I feel like um his whole career is kind of the just like incredulous, like I need a moment to even process how crazy you are.
Yeah, I know exactly the face you're talking about. I've never even seen that show, but yeah. Um, I don't know. I sort of What did you just ask? I can't even remember. I don't know. I feel like my brain is fried.
Oh, I mean that I don't remember. I think we were just talking about the anti-hero. And oh, is that like if we're gonna start going back away from the
Uh,
anti-hero, is that a move backwards or is that a move forward?
you feel like you can be somewhat complex, and people don't have to be all good or all bad. I don't think it has to be John Wayne, Cowboys and Indians. It doesn't have to be that like Manichean dualistic. It could be richer than that. But yeah, and it shows where it was so funny. I don't know if you remember during when Breaking Bad was on TV, but people be like, "Oh man, I hate Skyler. I hate her." Be like, she's a good guy. Like Walt no longer needs the money. He admits that he does it for his own vanity. He's the villain. And like, but like the show, I remember at points too in Sopranos watching it and rooting for Tony, and then being like, wait, how has this show manipulated me into rooting for like the FBI? They're the good guys. Like Tony is not a good person. He should not be out in the wild. Um, so I just don't want it to be some of those shows like Scorsese always says that he's not trying to glamorize organized crime. I was like, whatever.
Okay.
I don't feel like you do anything to lampoon it or undermine that impression. Every time I watch it, I'm like, so are you just cool with this, or is you're like new, like you don't take a stance? It's just neutral, or it feels like glamorous.
Yeah. Well, that's something that I think occurred to me kind of a lot later than I expected. That the movie Goodfellas is like thematically very simple. Is that it's like the Goodfellas are bad, and like um, I know that doesn't sound like soup like a big revelation, but I would say that like if anything, that's like the thematic core of that movie. It's like a very hyper focused, clear view of like of moral of like a moral flip that like from those earliest scenes, the first time he gets arrested, the whole family shows up, but they're not like sad. They're all there to applaud him because he like didn't squeal, you know? And then like when he shoots the kid he's just like, "What? I'm a good shot. Like, what do you expect me not to shoot him?" And like the biggest issue is just that they're gonna like have to take care of his body now, and not that they like just killed somebody. Um, and so like that is, I think, obviously it's one of the like classically considered one of the greatest movies of all time, or definitely the past couple decades. But yeah, I guess like on a broad scale, when society does look at that, to have this kind of like this kind of making you look at these protagonists that are very specifically bad. Because what's interesting is like, yeah, like a lot of them aren't even morally ambiguous. It's like they're just bad. They're just like actually bad people doing these things that are like, yeah, I guess like their situation kind of led them there, but you're not like even left to think that they had a big debate about it in their head. They were just kind of like, yeah, like we're like, because and so much of that too is, again, I think it's just because like they're the protagonist, and so the whole structure sort of makes you root for them,
It's true.
and it's fun because you kind of like live vicariously through these people that end up coming out of conflicts so much more powerfully than I think your average person does, who like isn't willing to kill and lie and cheat and steal. Um,
That's certainly
because like
true.
yeah, like I guess that's why I'm conflicted, because I do like the idea of these kind of stories that are a little bit more moral, and the main character is like a good person and that kind of thing. But I guess I'm gonna have to watch the Jason Sudeikis show, I think, because I want to see,
Or Reed Wendell Berry.
or read Wendell Berry. All right.
Yeah, that sounds good. Oh shit, man, there was something else I was gonna say though. Wait, rewind it real quick. Take me back.
Let's see. We're talking about Goodfellas.
Oh, I remember.
Oh,
Sorry. And we can cap it. We can cap it here if you want. But I
sure.
want to. There's a New Yorker article. I don't read the New Yorker like obsessively. It's just come up on
Okay,
this
Ross.
shows. Like,
You've
yes,
heard enough, I think.
I'm very erudite. Yes. Of uh, uh, have you read A Confederacy of Dunces?
I started it my sophomore year of college, and I kind of got away from it. So I didn't actually finish it, but I have like a vague idea of what it's about.
So yeah, there's a great New Yorker article about it recently because people were treating Ignatius like he was the hero. But if you haven't read it, he okay, mini rant. Don Quixote in the book is a madman. He's not nice. It's not like Man of La Mancha where he's a noble guy who was born in the wrong century, but he has a beautiful soul. In the book, he's like, God help you if you come across Don Quixote in the plains of Spain, because he may harm you in grievous ways. Like one of the examples is there's a scene where he sees a bunch of dust on the plain below and he thinks it's an invading Moorish army. So he gets his lance and he charges a shepherd with sheep. It's not a Moorish army. But that isn't like a cute, like, so noble. So the modernity is corrupt and the old ways were better. Ignatius Riley in Confederacy of Dunces is like that too, where he's reading Boethius and he's like talking about medieval philosophy and scholasticism. And he lives with his mom and is just like causing trouble everywhere and is like obese and unhappy
Doesn't he always
and
complain about his tubes? Like his tubes are
his valve.
his
It's,
valve.
oh,
Oh, that's
my
right.
valve is acting up again. I must, you have angered me, sir. Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff like that. Or it's basically people who idolize Patrick Bateman, the other Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. You're like, yeah, I'm sure he says some funny things about Huey Lewis and the news. That's cool, I guess. But also, he's a murderer and sociopath and terrible. So, so the article is about why we choose these sort of protagonists, like because American Psycho is making fun of pathological Wall Street culture in the '80s, right? Is not saying this is a good way to exist. The Boethius, not Boethius, Confederacy of Dunces is not there to like say this is a good way to, you should emulate this guy, but people do. I don't know.
I feel that same thing with Taxi Driver, because I had never
Same. Yep.
seen Taxi Driver until this year, actually, during the pandemic. I finally broke down and watched it. But I had seen this on like so many dorm room walls, and like Robert De Niro looking all cool and stuff like that. And so I
You
don't know. I
talking
don't
to
think
me?
these, what was that?
Said you talking to me? You don't
Exactly.
see anybody else here.
Um, so I think I had that vibe with that movie because I expected to see, like one of Scorsese's bests. And I actually didn't like it that much because it did kind of seem like it was just glorifying the descent of this guy into like extremism and that kind of thing. And not that it's like immoral or like would have, or I mean, it's obviously immoral, but like not immoral that people like it. But I think kind of what makes people identify with it is that like it's an outlet for all of these like kind of, and I'm not trying to say this in a Freudian sense, but just of like any kind of repressed bad emotions that you have consciously, of like not willing to engage in conflicts with the same fervor that you do in your head in the shower or that kind of thing. And so if you see some sort of badass character that's like kind of coldly and stoically chopping people up in Patrick Bateman's case, or just like taking strong action in like Robert De Niro's case, it ends up kind of being like, I don't know, some sort of like catharsis to see that. Because like I know you're not necessarily saying like, oh, the video games are causing mass shootings, or that sort of angle, but it is, I think I share your concern as well, is that it is this very kind of troubling trend of like seeing all these protagonists that do have such like, again, not morally ambiguous, but like clearly bad negative dispositions. So like it kind of makes me think too, is that like examples of bad people in the world are just so much more available than um people who are just like worth emulating, because it's so easy to deconstruct any kind of image of someone who's presented as like somebody worth emulating. Like anytime we see it, like whether find skeletons in the closet, or you'll see it exposed as just being fake, or ego, like that's why I struggle with like kind of like Ram Dass and a lot of those kind of spiritual types. And I love that kind of stuff from a philosophical perspective. But even if they aren't sexual deviants or predators, or murderers or anything like that, at the very least, I'm just kind of like, I just hear ego more than I hear a genuine, morally good person, you know? So like it's tough. And from a creative perspective, it does make me want to try to write a character that is like good and not in this kind of like idealistic hollow way.
I think it's easier with comedy than drama because I can think of good characters from comedy. The easiest example I thought of was the NBC mockumentaries like Parks and Rec and The Office.
That is true. Yeah. Kimmy
Like,
Schmidt. Kimmy Schmidt is like a
there you
very,
go.
I
There you go.
love
It's
Kimmy
like,
Schmidt. Just a
okay.
fantastic character.
And it's all sort of like broadly of the same universe, at least by actors and yeah, voice. Um, yeah. Although there are shows too, like 30 Rock was fun because Tina Fey espoused liberal values or progressive values, but she was constantly a hypocrite and like siding with Jack. And Jack's like, "Oh, there's a better option for us, elite Liz. You don't have to scrape down there with those loser writers." And she'd be like, "Oh, yes," but then she'd have to pretend to be like, "Oh no, I actually believe in equality." And I was like, that tension was super funny because she and Jack are kind of closer than you would think. Um, so, but there's like heart in there. But for all dramas, I think there needs to be hard choices or something. I can't even think of like a single yeah, and Ted Lasso I think is a comedy too. So with or drama, man, I think that might be just is there anything I can even think of?
I mean,
Detective stories, I guess. They're sort of like they got a hard edge to them, but
yeah. Well, because that's, I mean, I think that's true, but like so much of the anti-hero, I think historically came from detective fiction. And like, because the
yeah.
whole point is like, yeah, they're fighting for a good, but it's their own personal good. And they've got to break a bunch of eggs in order to make that omelet,
They're
Like,
like amoral too. Like I don't think they believe they're mercenaries too, right?
yeah.
They're just trying to get paid. They've been hired.
Yeah, I took a class in college that argued that the whole noir genre actually started from the like idea of the absurd and existentialism, and that it is like
Hmm.
it's someone asserting their own order onto a chaotic world, and that's why like I think that did at least contribute to the birth of the anti-hero in a lot of ways, because like after we kind of get to a point in society that we accept that these overarching truths aren't real anymore, then a lot of storytelling does descend into it. It's like, well, I'll make my own code.
Yeah, I chose like maybe the single worst example then. Like,
Well, I see what you mean, but I think a lot of it too is just very subjective, because like a lot of things that drive story too are like conflict and setbacks and mistakes that have like big consequences and things like that. So I guess like what would be the defining thing of that like sort of positive character? Would it be just like their optimism, their perspective that they need to like do good, these higher values that they're going toward?
maybe that they have a good heart. Um, I was actually thinking about this morning, but the Book of Mormon's kind of like that. There's all these jokes about how like none of this stuff really makes sense, and here's a bunch of examples of it, and they sort of willfully go into danger um, for what they lampshade as being kind of a not so good purpose, which is converting someone to Mormonism. So like the play itself does not think Mormonism is something that you should convert to. It doesn't seem like
Right,
so,
right.
so these characters are kind of farcical because they are putting themselves in danger to spread a message that the creators do not think should be spread to that extent or not made fun of. But they are good characters, and like you root for them, and they have good hearts. Like they're doing what they believe is right, and there's no sort of ulterior, mean, self-interested purpose in that kind of way. Um, so maybe it's just about having a good heart. Is that too embarrassing of an answer?
No, not at all. I'm just curious because I like the more that I think about it, it's like I think you could kind of define that in so many different ways of
Mhm.
like whether the character is good or not. Because I'm thinking too in a lot of these cases that like what you said for like Parks and Rec and for Kimmy Schmidt and a lot of the like NBC, like Michael Scott at the end of the day, like is a good person, right?
Compare him to Ricky Gervais, right? Who is not a good person.
See, I didn't watch that one. I
Oh, I
but
don't. I'm on
his
Team America on that one,
okay,
actually. Yeah.
fair. But I think that like the upshot to some of those as examples though is that like those characters are very frequently the butt of the joke. Um, and so like because so much of the comedy I feel like in Kimmy Schmidt comes from her like kind of encountering people that end up sort of like cynically either taking advantage of how positive she is or just like making fun of her for being so naive. And like both Leslie Nope and Michael Scott are not like particularly respected people. Leslie Nope probably is more than Michael Scott is, but like
They're both naive, though.
they're very naive. And I would especially say for Michael Scott, for as much as he is this beloved character, he's definitely not someone you would want to emulate. You know, he does have a pure heart. Like there's no doubt there. But I just started watching Fargo actually,
I
and
watched the first season. I think
does
it's
it
all
get
I
bad?
saw. No, I just it's
Got away
hard
from
to maintain momentum on any of these shows. But yeah,
because I think in Fargo's like mostly a drama, even though it's a little bit like kind of has some fun with the whole accent thing. Um, I feel like a lot of the cops there are very morally pure, but they're not really the protagonists. Were you going to say something after the NBC comment? I just kind of that just occurred to me right now about Fargo. But
that was good. I would only say for the like British versus American Office, the Ricky Gervais version, he like Michael Scott's a goofball, but he saves the day on multiple occasions and puts the office first and cares about his employees and hates it when any of them are like going to leave for any reason. Like he's like his heart is in the right place. He's not very smart, but he cares. Ricky Gervais is just sort of not funny, intrusive, boorish, selfish. Like he doesn't have any of the upside of Michael Scott. So the show feels bad. The show, you're laughing at him. Um, you like to see him fail. Uh, and it's just sort of it like makes me feel kind of it's cringy and it hurts. It's just not uplifting in the same way like the American Office I think is uplifting in some ways.
That's fair. Yeah, because Michael Scott is very earnest at the end of
He
the day.
there's some it's when the one of the branches is closing and Jim says something like, "Say what you will about Michael Scott, he would never do that." Where his boss was taking like leveraged his deal with Thunder Mifflin to go to Staples or something. And it's like that's true. Michael would never sell out the company for a better deal for himself like that. Ricky Gervais absolutely would. He would do it without even like having to push that hard. He's like so self-interested that he would just do it. And
So
yeah.
that makes me wonder then, is that like, is this what we're talking about? Because I'm still thinking with like a lot of those kind of more positive, naive characters, like, is that something kind of beyond an aesthetic thing? Where is that just something about like trying to be a good person that you are just gonna like occasionally get made fun of and be naive and or is because I'm again I'm trying to conceptualize like what is the image of this person who is like good, has a good heart, earnest, but doesn't necessarily have like the comedic naive aspects of Kimmy Schmidt and Michael Scott and Leslie Knope.
Yeah. It's
Is
um
it Ross Kenyon? Or are you the star?
no, I think it's like what I think of is um that naivete and just it's sort of like archetypic archetypally being a teenager is sort of rebellious and your parents are oppressive and horrible people. There are people for whom that is true. That's fine.
Mm,
Or it's not fine, but it exists. But then there's also a part of maturity that is like growing past that and loving your family and working at a job and contributing to society and you know doing the boring adult things of joining the Kiwanis Club or whatever and going to PTA meetings. And I think there's something that's like okay, I have a better example of this for you on the
okay.
same theme. uh when I first started watching King of the Hill, god, like 20 years ago,
Oh, there you go. I love it already. Keep going.
I thought this was going to be a joke about how Hank Hill is just a rube and is just going to be mocking him. Imagine like if Seth MacFarlane did King of the Hill, it
Sure.
would basically just be pointing at these sort of like lower middle class Texan kind of conservative idiots. But Mike Judge clearly has like a great deal of affection. And I think he has a great deal of affection for his characters because he recognizes that the world would not operate successfully without Hank Hill in it. He's the guy who reads his insurance policy. He knows how all of his tools works. If his sewer backs up, he knows how to fix it. Like that's that sort of like basic humanity is actually really cool. And becoming like an older 30 something person is realizing like, wow, that is super cool that the guy does that, as opposed to just being like I'm in a coffee shop and I can read books and talk about them on a podcast, but I can't do anything. Like, can I please have a 6-figure income?
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah.
kind of stupid. So I like that sort of affection for, I don't know, like that baseline of self-sufficiency and adulthood and grown-upness. That's like a character I gravitate towards for that reason.
I think that's an excellent example too, because there are plenty of like moments in King of the Hill where he is the butt of the joke, but he's definitely not naive or like he's still the kind of the leader of his little crew, you know?
He's a little naive, but yeah, he's certainly like
Well, I guess like he might be naive in a certain way, but it's like it doesn't seem like he's anybody's fool, if that makes sense.
yeah, he has like a strong map of the world. It's just the map isn't always super correct. But when it's not correct, it's not incorrect in a malicious way either. Like it doesn't seem like he's a mean-spirited or bad person.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite things about Hank Hill too is that like he does like not always want to do the right thing, but he just feels like he has to. Like so many times are of him like his buddies all coming up with some sort of scheme that he wants no part in. and then at the end it just gets to the point where he's like, you know what, like I've got to clean it up because it's right, and that is like literally the role that I play here. So that's interesting. Yeah, that
Is that our aesthetic ideal now? Hank Hill?
Hank Hill as form.
Write
Uh,
that essay, get it published in a literary journal. Let's do it.
yeah, because he is really cool, and hmm, yeah, like again though, it's like all of these examples are from comedies, which is I think something that you pointed out at the beginning is that like I think comedy probably just gives it enough of that kind of play so that you can have them do those silly things like because Hank does have like kind of these transcendent ideals and ideas of right and wrong and that kind of thing, but some of them include like having a firm handshake and things that are like seem kind of arbitrary, even though that's like a conventionally or a conventional sign of like characters to have a stiff handshake. So I guess in a drama, I'm wondering, is it because like I'm picturing for a drama, it would have to almost be like a come across like more determined and aggressive, like someone fighting for good, as opposed to just because like a lot of the sort of plot points that come up in these shows are not very life and death. You know, it's a lot of them just like kind of solving these small scale problems because they know that it's right, and so like I feel like with a drama the stakes would have to be a little bit bigger.
Some of them, I wonder if zooming in and having it be more quotidian, family life oriented has more opportunity for this. Like the examples that we chose of these high drama, artsy, Sergeant Peppery moments for television. Um, like those are extreme examples, right? Mobster and then teacher turned meth cook dealer. That's
Right.
sort of, but did you ever watch 6 Feet Under?
Oh no, that's another one that's been recommended to me like 1,000 times, but I haven't seen it.
I think I've seen it all the way through. I think 3 times. Uh, it's terrific. It's soapy at points, but um, I do love it, and I think that's a drama. And the characters, they're complex, and they certainly all have faults, but they're not put into this position where like they seem like normal people trying to do their best. And I think where television went this route of being like Tony Soprano is not a normal person trying to do his best. Walter White is not a normal person trying to do his best. The characters on 6 Feet Under are, you
Hmm.
know, so maybe it's this like extremifying. God, that's a terrible word. This like making this like trying to be like pitching a show, be like, what if we had a show about the mob? And I know there's a lot of mob content, and there has been for decades, but what if we made it like a really relatable character? He goes to therapy and we get to see inside his head, and we spend a lot of time with his family. His family is not just like his kid and his wife that he cheats on, but like we spend a lot of time with Carmela and Anthony Jr. and Meadow, and like we're like really a part of the like what is it like to be in the family of a mobster on a daily basis? That's an extreme pitch, and it's good. Or what about a teacher who gets cancer, but he, creates drugs to pay for it? That's like a great, if you had to pitch that in a meeting, oh, it's like one sentence, you're done. Like it's such,
Yeah.
right? It's like so simple. So, but it's extreme. Like regular family drama is in some ways like, who am I thinking of? Swedish guy.
I don't know.
The playwright. The playwright. Come on, he's like the
Oh, Ibsen.
Ibsen. It's like Ibsen, right? It's just like about families, like hanging out and their troubles and dealing with issues of the day and philosophies and feminism and how do people react to that, right? Um, that's like normal people dealing with stuff that is hard. So is maybe that a useful distinction? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely interesting. I guess I haven't read a lot of Ibsen, but when I usually think of like a family-based play, it's always like oh, and the father, who we thought was a good man, it turns out has some skeletons in his closet. But also another thing that came to mind was like Seventh Heaven, which is I definitely don't think on the cutting edge aesthetically.
I
And
definitely watched that show growing up, though. I also thought
oh, I
about that show.
did. I think the main guy in that too, the dad ended up being some sort of like child predator or something.
I don't remember the details, but yeah, I remember something happened. Yeah, that show, it was like it feels really hard to make good Christian content too, that is like a faith-based show that isn't kind of hackneyed, even though that show certainly was. It is like made for like families so they could watch together with young kids and teach them, it's like
Right.
moral lessons. And um it's crazy because I can only think of like a couple things recently that are ostensibly Christian and overtly so that are good. It's like Sufjan Stevens and Nick Cave, and I don't know. I don't even know if I could name anything. Maybe Silence by Scorsese.
Oh, I haven't seen that one, but
The
Neutral Milk
book's cool too.
Hotel seems to have like an unironic interest in Jesus, right?
Hmm. So maybe so that's floating in there. But yeah, having this sort of good-hearted, the basics, that kind of thing, it's really hard to do. King of the Hill, I think, is remarkable because it pulls off this like simple goodness in a way that doesn't feel like Seventh Heaven, right? It
Yeah.
feels like it feels like a normal life kind of deal.
Well, that's where it's tough because like I feel like it's so much easier to engage with morality from the bad side because like it these are probably like straw man or straw stories to follow the metaphor, but it's like if you were to like write a story where the moral is like lying is bad, you have to show someone like lying and having consequences for it, right? Which is fine. That's what like plenty of stories do. But then for the moral, I almost feel like there has to be some kind of falling action after the climate or after the climax where they're like, ah, I guess it is just better to tell the truth, right, Dad? And then they like walk off into the sunset or something like that.
Mm.
So, um, did you see True Detective season one?
Yeah, I don't think I finished it though. I I kind of I didn't really get what all. I mean, that one thing where they did the super long take, that scene was incredible,
That was cool.
but for the most part, I don't think I really got it.
So this really gives away how little I watch TV because that I think came out like 5 or 6 years ago now. But
Mhm.
basically, like it's in my opinion kind of an exploration of nihilism because you have Matthew McConaughey's character and he's going through super depressed over the death of his daughter, alcoholic, explicitly antagonistic toward religion and any kind of like higher sense of order or morals. And then you have your serial killer who is some sort of like a cult leader guy that is like crucifying people in these really bizarre ways with like animal antlers and that kind of thing. And then in the last scene, you have Woody Harrelson and Matthew McConaughey having this conversation where Matthew McConaughey had just gotten shot and he like almost dies and has some sort of like trippy transcendent experience in like the liminal space between life and death. And Woody Harrelson the whole time keeps telling Matthew McConaughey to like shut up, I'm sick of your like nihilistic musings about the world. But then Woody Harrelson asks him, he's like, tell me about that thing you told me that one time. And so it's like his big character changes. He like opens up and is like willing to listen to what Matthew McConaughey has to say. And then Matthew McConaughey has this like extended monologue about how when he was in that space between life and death, he saw that there is this bigger order to everything and it's light versus dark. And he felt like the love of his dead daughter. And I think the last line ends up being something along the lines of Woody Harrelson looking up and being like, well, it looks like the dark has a lot more territory than the light. And then they kind of like walk away, but then Matthew McConaughey is like, no, you're looking at it wrong. I think the light's starting to win. And that's like the end of the first season. And so it's like, as far as I'm concerned, kind of a postmodern show, extremely engaged with like dismantling meta narratives and that kind of thing. But it does end on a very explicitly hopeful note. So does that count? Is this
It could. count. I think that sounds more positive than not. It sort of reminds me of No Country for Old Men's ending too. Although that one's like the same but grim. I don't know. Do you remember
Yeah.
that?
Yeah,
Where he's
well,
like,
because that one's like it ends, and what I take from that is that it's a very explicit statement that there's no meaning to anything, and this guy who like signed up on the police force to like fight for good is being like, I was nothing prepared me for a guy that shoots people in the head with a cattle pressure thing, and there's no point to anything, right?
kind of, yeah. And he's talking about how he had a dream, and him and his dad were on a horse going over a mountain pass in the snow, and they were like trying to keep like a fire like kindled like on the like horn of the saddle or something like that. And uh, the like overall point of the story, as I remember it, is that like there's always a small band of people who are trying to do the right thing and keep order, and like make society worth fighting for. But evil never sleeps, right? Anton Chigurh doesn't sleep. He's not human. Evil just goes and goes. It doesn't need food, water, medical attention. It just never stops. Where he has to sleep, good has to sleep. And so like the version of that is darker than maybe True Detective, but it's also similar. Is good or evil winning in the universe? That's another axis or metric by which you could evaluate shows based on like how optimistic they're feeling, which is, I think even asking that question is good, because shows like Sopranos seemingly don't ask it or don't even care, because you want to root for Tony, and it's just sort of, if there is, I'm not even sure that rooting for Tony is moral. I think it's just amoral. I don't think the show has a morality, basically.
Yeah,
At least Breaking Bad, though, at the end of it, you at least are like, Walt saves Jesse, like he's kind of he's selfish and ruined his family and did all these horrible things and killed all these people, but he has like some amount of redemption, and Jesse escapes slavery. So that one kind of feels a bit more optimistic, but yeah.
yeah, because I think just from a satisfaction standpoint, kind of all the like literary lens aside, as a viewer, it does feel good to have some sort of like liberatory ending, like Jesse driving through that gate at the end.
Ooh,
Break that.
unforgettable, right? That
Oh, it's such a good moment. And
yeah.
like, yeah, like philosophy aside, that is just like great storytelling and a great image to set his character free. So then, because if I understand correctly, and I actually haven't finished The Sopranos, doesn't The Sopranos end on kind of like a, it just cuts out like, but it's
Yeah,
like kind of heavily implied that maybe he gets shot or something like that.
yeah, and there's talk about, do you remember that episode where they're in the Pine Barrens? Have you gotten that far?
Oh, it's been so long since I've seen any of it. I watched some of the first season like a year ago, but
Oh, there's like a one-off episode where Christopher and, Polly take, like a Russian guy into the woods to kill him, and the guy turns out to be like ex Spetsnaz, Russian special forces, and like escapes. And so there's all these fan fiction theories about being like, maybe he came back and
oh,
finally got Tony. But I think David Chase has been like, no, that's not what happens. Stop writing me mail asking me. Um, but yeah, I think it is ambiguous, which, it's sort of, it fits the show, right? And that's what I don't like, is the ambiguity of, seemingly the show says like, if there is a difference between the FBI and Tony, it's not important because we're not going to explore if there are differences. Now, another HBO show. Did you watch Big Love? You ever see that?
no, no.
Okay, I don't know that. I mean, it's amazing cast too, and there's a lot of good stuff to it. But so he's a polygamist living in Salt Lake City, but is one of the good ones, right? So like, there's been no like trafficking or like choosing young women out of books or anything. So he like, it's based upon consent, and it's like modern polygamy. But he's one of the Lost Boys, where if you grew up on a fundamentalist compound in Utah, once you become like at sexual maturity, the old guys kick you out so that they can marry the young women and are not in competition with you. So he was one of those, a Lost Boy. But the whole show is asking this question of being like, is Bill different from where he comes from? Is this modern version better, because he oftentimes still has to deal with the fundamentalist compounds and gets involved in some shady stuff too. And so it's an open question that's being asked, and like you can tell that that's the point of the show, is to ask it. I don't think Sopranos ever asked that question. The show just sort of takes it for granted. It's just like Tony exists, the FBI exists, come what may. Like that's not like, like, okay, cool. I mean, it's a cool show, but it's not like trying to explore that issue in that kind of way.
So this is kind of a leading question, because I kind of get a vibe of what your answer would be, but like, how much do you think um, stories, and maybe specifically like TV dramas, demand that kind of like deeper investigation? Because I get into many arguments with people about this, where I feel like people kind of unfairly project on to me, thinking that it has to have some sort of deep symbolic interpretation involved. And I'm like, I don't think it necessarily has to be doing all this like weird formal play and that kind of thing. But to me, what makes stories good is when there is something kind of going on under the surface that has a lot to do with like character and exploring morality and that kind of thing. So, like, and again, I'm not trying to divide it into like mere entertainment versus the real literature and things like that, but it almost seems to, I pose this as a question in order to just get on my soapbox in order to talk about
So you host a podcast, is what you're saying? Yeah, yeah.
um, but but yeah, it's like I think my argument for doing that kind of investigation is that the basic structure of storytelling already leaves those breadcrumbs there for you. So like, even when you have that flash of inspiration that's just a great pithy scene or a great moment, a lot of that like kind of archetypal language is already there. And it's a matter of like using that in your arsenal or not, because like you said, or maybe I don't know as much as with the Sopranos, but like there are some stories that I think you like and you end up kind of connecting with because they have a great character or a cool world that they build, but then they feel unsatisfying because you're like, oh, they never really like delivered on some of that like meteor thing that felt promised in the first half of it.
uh Re-ask it, do it one more time. I don't know that I caught it all.
Okay, so like, do you think that do you think that that like kind of more that like deeper investigation in a story is like necessary, or are my haters right that some stuff is just, it just is what it is and I'm reading into it too much, and like,
Yeah,
I can make it a little bit more discreet, that
go
like with
ahead.
the Sopranos, does the Sopranos demand an investigation of that morality, or is it playing in a territory that doesn't need to like address all of those things?
I think for Sopranos it's the latter, and I think for the time it was noteworthy. So maybe before Sopranos we would have expected it to take a stronger stance, and maybe being neutral and ambiguous is, remarkable for its time, whereas now we're just like, it's another show that does this. But of course it was like the show that started it, so maybe it's more easy to forgive it for that reason. um yeah, leaving breadcrumbs around, I don't know. I think 6 Feet Under is a good example of a show like that too. Like if you ask me, it's like the pitch for Breaking Bad has a fundamental irony, right? High school teacher gets cancer. He's a chemistry teacher. He sells drugs to help his family once he dies, but he actually survives, discovers he likes being a drug dealer, and now has to hide it from his family as he becomes like the biggest kingpin in the Southwest. The irony is like just like built into that so tightly. It's so perfectly. 6 Feet Under, I would just say something like, it's about death and family, and it isn't trying to say something like everybody dies. I guess it kind of does say that, because every episode is about their family's mortuary having how their client died. That's how every single show opens, except for I think the last one. The last one opens with a birth. So
Feeling that.
I mean, Alan Ball is smart. interesting writer. And I think having it be that way where it doesn't have that sort of just, it's not twist driven, it's not irony driven, it's sort of a lot more open ended with that. I don't even know what it's about, and that doesn't stop it from being an amazing show, though. Is that kind of what you're asking? Like, yeah, it doesn't have to
Kind of,
be something
and
more than
I
that.
might not even totally know what I'm asking, but maybe to approach it from another angle is like right now I'm reading a book of short stories by Silvina Ocampo, who's kind of like a
Mm,
contemporary of Borges. She's an Argentine writer.
okay.
And what I really like about the stories that I've read so far is that it is not clear that any interpretation is really required because some of them are so short and so abstract that like it just feels like a dream. Or like she did one where it's about like a young girl going over to her friend's house with her dad, and the young girl peers through the window and like sees the dad and the other girl's dad having a serious conversation, and one of them starts crying, and then they leave, and that's like the whole story. And what's really
Mm,
cool about it is it like it really does kind of put you back into that feeling of being a kid when you're around your parents when something beyond you is going on, and it's never revealed like what they're crying about, what they're talking about. But what makes it such a successful story is that it's like it just really vividly gives you that feeling that like you're back as a kid. And the one before that too, it feels like a dream because it's about this girl that was under the impression that babies come from Paris in a little box. And then people keep trying to change that idea for her. And then at the end, she's sitting on her mom's lap, and they're looking out at like through the window, and her mom kind of like changes her idea about where babies come from, and she looks back at her mom, and her mom is a different face now. And it's like it's so abstract. It's like I mean you could write an essay like extrapolating it, but to me it's all about like experience. So like I'm not necessarily like talking about coming up with some sort of specific moral or interpretation, but more of like taking a look at that archetypal language that's used in order to build imagery, and evaluating whether or not a story uses that or uses it in spite of itself. You know, let me
yeah,
give one more example.
go
And,
ahead.
and
Yeah.
I brought this up to you before, is that Austin Powers, okay? Austin Powers, and again, before everybody gets their panties in a bunch, is that I love Austin Powers, okay? But speaking of those breadcrumbs, I swear to God, the first act of that movie leaves breadcrumbs with its storytelling about a misogynist from the 1960s that's transported into 90s of or like the 90s, the contemporary time at the time, and it demands this sort of feminist awakening or at least exploration on Austin Powers, and they like totally betrayed that. Now, again, I'm not stupid. I know that Austin Powers was not trying to do that, but they give you such a beautiful opportunity just with the choices that they make. All interpretations aside, just the actual like archetypal language of the story sort of demands that. And so like just being a pedantic person watching it from a story perspective is like it feels like a missed opportunity. Or if like it had been made today, Austin Powers would have had like a much cooler investigation of him like womanizing, and the whole second act would have been way different. See what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think I'm getting closer to it. I think maybe if we can explore an example you dropped earlier, maybe this will clear it up. Like Tim and Eric is so surreal. I often describe it as satanic or demonic.
Yeah.
I feel like I've opened up a parallel universe or like a portal to a dimension where men were not meant to tread. And I don't know that I could explain a lot of their. Okay, did you ever watch I Think You Should Leave?
Yes.
Do you
Yes.
remember, dude?
Yeah.
My favorite sketch is the Johnny Cash one, where he starts singing about the bones and the skeleton and the skeletons and how their money works. It's the scene from Walk the Line where they're like time in front of the recording studio execs are like, we don't want any of your gospel music. You got anything else? And he starts to play Walk the Line.
Was this in a second season?
I think it was
Or
the
is there a
first.
second season? sorry to interrupt because I thought I'd seen that entire show. I don't remember that one though.
Right,
No,
I'll show you. It,
okay.
it it kills me, man. It's so Johnny Cash starts singing this song that's sort of like, shot a man Reno just to watch him die, like a version of that. And then God, whatever the what's the guy's name who does the show?
Tim Robinson.
Yeah, Tim Robinson is like playing bass, and so he just jumps in and starts improvising lyrics about how there's like all these skeletons, and they got in the various ways that they have money and how they spend their money when they come back to life. And like Johnny Cash keeps trying to be like, stop. so like, so like, I can understand like being in the pitch meeting and being like, what if like the bass player for Johnny Cash thinks that Johnny Cash needs help and keeps offering alternative lyrics to the song and ruins it. I'm like, that's a great pitch. I totally get it. Tim and Eric's like, what if it's like a news program, but then we edit it in this glitchy way that is terrifying? You're like, the show's all post-production. Like there's like some interesting characters and some weird stuff. But besides that, it's like, what is the sketch about? I don't know. It's just weird, terrifying surrealism. That's not
Yeah,
true for all of them, but yeah.
because I think that is kind of like part of their genius is that it is very like not witty. It's not a thing you're supposed to take from it, except like obviously I think it's like a satire of like bad B grade TV. But the
There's a lot of
whole
that.
I think thing that really makes their comedy style, and I attribute it a little bit more to Tim than to Eric, is it's just this mood. It's this like silly mood that they bring to these performances that I think really capture like what it feels like to be a person trying to present themselves well, but just flubbing over every line and then like still kind of trying to smile through it at the end. Um,
There's
but
a lot of
yeah,
that in
so
there. Yeah.
or sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I said, yeah, there's a lot of that in there too. And it's like, yeah, public access TV, like entertainers who are not successful, sort of badly produced. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right. Yeah, so much of it too is just this like really weird thing that is like it would be kind of hard to like tell someone about because you're right. It's like I never seen the Tim Robinson sketch before, but like I laugh just because in that premise is a very funny thing that I'm like, oh, okay, that surely comedy will arise from this. But with their thing, it's just so performance driven. It's like it's not always about
In editing.
an edit. Yeah, yeah. It's like the whole so because that would be hard to emulate, I think, from like a storytelling perspective of like their voice is so strong and so tuned in, but it's not necessarily something that like that you could just kind of like because you can parrot their voice and a lot of people do, but I guess like the writing is not really something that's like easy to follow. I don't think.
No, there's a bunch of sketches like that too. Like, okay, another favorite sketch of mine is I think Adam McKay wrote this at SNL, super long ago. And it was one of those sketches I think that was in the last couple minutes before the show ended, where it's like they might cut for time and it's not their best stuff.
Mhm.
But it was Vlad the Impaler was meeting with his political entourage and asking his retinue, being like, "Why don't the people love me?" And they're like, well, your Majesty, you keep impaling them. You've really got to cool it on the impaling. He's like, no, it couldn't be that. It's got to be something else. Is it my agricultural policy? Mm, pretty sure it's the impaling. So like, that's one of those sketches where Vlad the Impaler is not taking advice from his political advisors, and this is why it's funny. Compare that to, did you ever watch the Kristen Wiig sketch Gilly?
Oh, is that where she had small hands? Is that a
I think there was
is
one
something
where she
else?
did that, but she just had like a giant afro and is this sort of like mean-spirited, like sociopathic grade schooler. And it's all like Will Forte would just be like scolding her, like she would do something bad and be like, Gilly. She'd be like, what? Gilly. And they're back, but like how do you write it? It's all like I couldn't pitch it in a meeting because it doesn't make any sense. It's just Kristen Wiig making funny sounds and dancing around. So I don't even know what to say about it because you couldn't pitch it because there's no pitch to it.
Yeah, there's no well, and to me though, like I think what we're kind of stumbling into is like that is one of the problems about developing some of those things into long form content because I will say for as much as I love Tim and Eric and a lot of those like SNL sketches, a lot of the like longer movies that they make or the longer projects that Tim and Eric have made, I think kind of fall flat because they don't engage with that storytelling. And again, I'm not expecting them to write something like a Thomas Pynchon novel where you can analyze it from all these angles. But what I'm getting at, what I was describing earlier too with the Austin Powers thing and Silvino Campo, is that it's like there is like the choices that you make in narrative content make promises to the audience. Like those are the breadcrumbs, you know? And some people I think are under the impression that it's all just creative inspiration and you can just make a bunch of great choices in a row and then have it be a story. But I think that like what you see, especially for comedy, is that they'll be like, all right, hilarious character, funny situation, 2 hour movie or hour and a half. And it's like, well,
Those
no.
are
And
hard.
like a lot of these comedies usually break down around the second act because it's like you establish your character, you establish the world, hilarious. But then like once you're expected to start caring about investigating what they put down for you, you're just kind of like, oh, like this is not really, it's not a story, or it's not good. It just feels like they stretched this out and they had to give it some kind of backbone to make it worth the time.
That's certainly true. Yeah, I would not want to see an hour and a half of Gilly. Nor, yeah, I've seen the $1 billion movie. That one's pretty hard to get through. One of the few movies that I think really holds its own for the 90 minutes as a sort of kind of dumb comedy. I think Dumb and Dumber is pretty.
Dumb and Dumber, yeah.
It never slows down. There's no fat on those bones. Like every scene, there's a purpose for it. It fits into the story. It advances the story. Many of them are funny. Like a lot of it is about their relationship and their character, and I'm invested the whole way through. The movie is underrated because it is just like a well-told story. Full stop.
That is true. Yeah, because it's like, and it's so absurd. Not a whole lot of straight man going on. Like a lot of the other secondary characters, but like the two dudes are both ridiculous, both stupid, and they do build it into this.
Well, it's because the world is the straight man. That's what I was saying earlier. Is like
Oh, that's right.
it's got
Yeah.
to be one or the other. So they're playing against a world that makes sense, which is why they're all like, "Are these guys like amazing assassins?" And like, why are they so good at this? And it's like, no, they're idiots.
I love
uh,
that trope, by the way, of like the person in spite of themselves just like foiling everybody else.
yeah.
You know what's a great, I think, story comedy too is Hot Rod.
Oh, I think I saw it when it came out, but I can't remember it hardly at all. Is
So
it also good?
it's been a couple years for me too, but like the sort of, I think like emotional core of the movie is that he needs to impress his either dad or stepdad.
Huh.
And so like it, I think if I remember correctly, maybe I'll watch it again and it's like total trash. But I remember thinking, one, it was very funny, but then two, it really earns the fact that it's a movie and is like him feeling the need to do some big climactic ending. I don't even remember what it was, in order to like show his stepdad that he's a worthy man or something like that. And
Wow.
it's not what you would expect from, oh, believe me.
Tearjerker. Yeah.
Exactly.
I like the way that you framed this. That makes sense to me too, where these like surreal kind of one-off things are not sustainable. Whereas like some of the best comedy movies too, I think came out of Matt and Trey from South Park. And they even said that they made Team America to make fun of Jerry Bruckheimer produced big budget, sort of like tentpole summer movies. And by the end of it, they're like, we love and respect the guy now. This was super hard to do, but their movies like the South Park Bigger, Longer, Uncut, and also Team America, um, they also just like they are well told story. Also musicals. They just love musicals. There's
Yeah.
like everything just like hangs together and it is sustained. I am happy to spend that time in that universe with them. But there's a whole bunch of like this stupid comedies. Basically, whenever SNL actors graduate, like most of those movies are trash, right? It's like there's no narrative core to Ladies Man. There's not a lot going on with a
What
superstar.
is Ladies Man? I don't even know what that is.
Tim Meadows had a talk show where he was the ladies man who would give advice
Oh,
for.
I think I can like picture the cover of that in like Blockbuster or something like that.
Yeah, there's a bunch of SNL movies that just like didn't need to. I don't think Step Brothers too. I sort of feel that way where I'm like, I remember when it came out, people were like, "Oh, it's so good." I was like, I'm 40 minutes in. I have all of these characters that I've ever needed to have. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm good. But there's a lot of movies like that pulling off. That's why there's so few like stupid comedies that I can think of, like The Jerk. There's some good Mel Brooks movies like
Mm.
Blazing Saddles. I'll always go back to. Blazing Saddles is also about something, um, which is pretty rare for comedies, I think, in that way. Like Dumb and Dumber, does it really have like a bigger theme? Like Blazing Saddles does.
What
Um,
is what's because I saw Blazing Saddles in high school, so that was like what's
gotta
the
go.
kind of deeper read on Blazing Saddles?
You should go back to it. But well, one, it has a great dot, and Holy Grail had the best postmodern endings for me as a child because they made me laugh so hard. I was like, how can you do this? Because the end of Blazing Saddles, they like they're like there's a big fight scene on the soundstage at the studio, and they like knock over a wall and they end up at a Busby Berkeley musical where there's all these like dancing guys,
I
and
do
then
vaguely remember that. Yeah.
they like run around like the studio lot and they're all fighting, and then they show the big fight is at the movie premiere. I'm like, how are you talking about how this is a movie inside of a movie? You shouldn't be allowed to do that.
I would never
um
engage with content like that. Anyway,
that that and also being arrested at the end of Monty Python the Holy Grail, that to me was just like the perfect, as a kid, just like blew my mind that you could even acknowledge like this alternate timeline coexisting. What whatever. But yeah, Blazing Saddles though, co-written with Richard Pryor. I think he was uncredited though, but it's about a black sheriff. Like the governor, I think, is trying to steal the land from out of Rock Ridge. So they send a black sheriff knowing that the town would not abide by it. So they try to run him out. And but they end up like sort of finding a way to coexist and fighting against the governor and his henchmen.
hmm.
And yeah, I mean, it's like it's kind of straightforward. It's about race, but it's also just like genuinely funny and great gags in there. So quotable. Um, but yeah, I don't know how many others are even like that. History of the World certainly is a lot more gag centric and just like more like sketch driven almost.
I'm a stand-up philosopher.
Yeah. What part of Ethiopia? 125th Street. I remember as a kid being like, I don't get this joke. I mean, like growing up being like, oh, that's like Harlem. That's oh, okay, I get this. Um, yeah, I love those movies. Yeah, and I guess not everything has to be about something to be fun. That's what I made that joke earlier. I'm not sure if you picked it up, but like I was referencing the Seinfeld. It's a show about nothing.
Oh yeah, no, yeah,
Oh, you got it. Okay, yeah.
yeah.
I love like the idea of going in and pitching it, being like, you know how most shows are about something? Not this one. This show's about nothing. Nothing? Nothing. And if you try to change it, we will walk out of here. I sort of I sort of love that.
Well, that just
Yeah.
completely, I think, set the standard for so many different sitcoms too, though, because that's like a completely different form that I think shirks so many storytelling conventions. Is that like isn't the shtick in a sitcom that the like equilibrium is just reestablished? That it's like a brief conflict that kind of rotates, and like every once in a while, I think, especially after a couple seasons, they'll do something that has like a more lasting consequence. But that is because it's a little snooty. I will say I do not particularly like sitcoms. I did watch a lot of them growing up, but I wouldn't say it was like my favorite. They were my favorite shows or anything like that. Um, but I feel like I'm trying to distance myself from sitcoms right now.
There's
But
there's like they're comforting and they're also common, and many of them are bad and like lowest common denominator. Like are you trying to distance yourself from Chuck Lorre basically? You don't want to be Big Bang Theory and King of Queens. And
well, I
by
mean,
the way, being a Ross, by the way, and traveling anywhere in the world, Friends is the first thing. You could be like in Uzbekistan and someone will be like, Ross from Friends, Ross Geller. And you'll be like, yes, that is it's like, wow, you guys get friends here, huh? Like it's
Yeah.
it's global. Seinfeld is not ever gonna make that leap. It's too weird.
Because like Friends was one of those shows that I did watch growing up, but not feeling any kind of connection to it whatsoever. Is that like we didn't have cable, and so just at a certain hour of night, it was just Friends that was on, and I would just kind of watch it. And then going back and watching it, I am a little confused as to how this has become such a broadly loved show. Um, I don't know. I feel like I'm speaking out of my realm a little bit because I don't have a lot of smart to say about it other than just like, really? Like,
I never really watched a ton of it. It was always on ambiently, and I've seen probably dozens of hours of it just by existing in a universe where Friends exists because it's so popular. But yeah, I'm not like a scholar of the show either. But I think you're right though. To single out sitcoms are comforting. They're also low status things to like. Um, well, assuming we're talking about multi-camera stage sitcoms,
yeah,
those okay, because like
because I love like
single
30
camera
Rock
gets a
and
little.
like, yeah, like there's technically things that are sitcoms that are like great shows. I mean, the more of like what you think, like the traditional, like there's a couch facing this and like, yeah, you never break the 180 line. And
A hold for applause. By the way,
yeah,
have you ever seen those videos where they edit out the laughter?
yes,
There's some from Friends that they've done for Ross that you're just like, this guy's terrifying.
yeah, it's very eerie.
Yeah, it's super eerie. But I like that about sitcoms too. The equilibrium's a great comment. It's nice to have shows where they're self-contained and almost picaresque in that way, right? You have like a little adventure and you come back and it's stand alone. And it's comforting to watch those. I think it's one of the reasons why people fall asleep to them. People put them on in the background while they're cooking. Comfort, simple.
I say
You know what you're getting.
they should strike them from the record. I
It's
say
right.
nothing but Dostoevsky from here on out. Televised Dostoevsky single cams.
Wow, that's a bold vision for 2021. Are
That's
we
right.
ready for this?
That's what we need to do instead of the new moral characters. I've never even read Dostoevsky, to be honest, but he just seems like that would really set everybody on a new. That's what this world needs, I think.
I've read so many of his books, but I've given up on more than one of them. And I always try, but it's not the length because I'll read old Russian books that are super long and enjoy them a lot, and that's fine. But Dostoevsky, I always feel like I am not connecting to it. I'm just like, is this not for me? Am I stupid? Why don't I love this? A lot of people I respect are like, you got to read Brothers Karamazov. It's so good. I'd be like, I'm kind of like struggling through this. Oh, the idiot's really interesting. Like, it's boring. I've read a lot of the novellas, and they're okay. I don't know. It's like, how much do you blame yourself for not appreciating a great work of art?
Yeah,
Do you always feel kind of like you read something, and you're like, everyone loves it. You're like, I don't get it. Am I dumb?
yeah. You know who I had that with is Kurt Vonnegut.
Oh,
And
but he's so fun though.
see, that's where I feel like it's got to be me because I'm not trying to say that it's bad, but I feel like attempted to read enough of his stuff where I'm like I objectively don't like this.
Well, yeah, that's fine. There's probably just no accounting for if it doesn't speak to you, like you can't force yourself to
Yeah,
like
but I
it.
wanted to like it. I've been excited before reading every book of his that I've tried, and it like I, most recently was Breakfast at Champions, and that's supposed to be like the best of all of his books, and I was so excited for it, and I sat down to read it, and I was just like, it just felt smarmy. It felt so like like look what I'm doing.
Yeah. That's the one with Bokononism in it, right?
I don't even know if I got that far.
It's like the new religion that he creates.
I like a
Yeah.
lot of contemporaries and a lot of people that like kind of get put in that same box, but I don't know, something about it. It just like when he was like describing, so we live in this place called America, and we have a funny way of doing things, like how he's like defamiliarizing the prison industrial complex and weird things like that. I don't know. It just felt very like
Yeah, like r slash I am very smart. Have you ever been on that subreddit?
yes, I'm very familiar.
Yeah, maybe some of it feels like that. I like that though about science fiction as having a sort of a Martian's view kind of approach. Like if you read, did you ever read the Illuminatus trilogy?
Robert Anton Wilson.
Yeah,
I know who he is, but I've never read that.
he does a lot of stuff like that too, where it's describing how society or politics works in a way that is zoomed out and abstracted in a way that maybe gives you some new insight into it. On the other hand, it could just be clumsy ways of expressing your politics, being like, in America, the rich people do everything and the poor people all do blah. And you're just like, it's written like a neutral anthropologist
Yeah,
kind of. Maybe it does feel smarmy to do that, but some of them I think are oftentimes insightful and very funny.
yeah. I
But
mean, I
maybe
wouldn't
Vonnegut
dismiss
more.
the whole technique. I'll keep it to Vonnegut just for now because I've heard that Robert Anton Wilson is really good. But you know, we've hit the 2 hour point, Ross.
Am I
We
did I ruin this for you? Is this even publishable now?
see. I have no idea. I've never tried to record one of these before. So, but I think in the interest of time, we'll stop the recording. I'm down to keep on chatting if you'd like, but let's officially sign off. Could you please one more time remind us the name of your podcast?
I'm sure you have all of me that you can stand for a while. You're a
I got more
camel filled
gas in
up.
the tank. I'm
You
very
got
lonely in this pandemic.
yeah, it's called Reversing Climate Change. You can find it in whatever podcast app you use, or you can find it at nori.com, Nori. And yeah, Danny, we could do this for just hours and hours and hours and hours. There's really no limit to it, I think.
That's
So
good. Well,
maybe some other time we'll have to do some more.
like I said, I'm down to keep chatting too, but just for the limit of this, I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording. So hopefully for everyone watching, if you made it to this point, I hope this helps you write better stories. Little Pringle here certainly agrees. And yeah, that was Ross Kenyon as my first guest. So goodbye.